Welcome to the Journal of Genocide Research Office Hours, our YouTube channel in which we discuss recent articles by the author of those articles. Today we have Keith Watenpaugh, who's the founding director of the University of California Davis Human Rights Studies Program, the first academic unit of its kind in that system. With the support of the American Council of Learned Societies and the National Endowment for the Humanities, he wrote the multiple award-winning book Bread from Stones, The Middle East and the Making of Modern Humanitarianism, which came out in 2015, and in 2006, Being Modern in the Middle East, which pioneered the study of the middle class and non-Muslim minorities in Arab Eastern Mediterranean societies. He has lived and worked in Syria, Turkey, Lebanon, Armenia, Iraq, and Egypt, and his writing has been translated into Arabic, Turkish, Persian, and German. Keith Watenpaugh has begun work on what will be the first comparative historical account of genocide and mass atrocity in the modern Middle East, and we're going to be talking about an article he published in the journal which gestures to those themes. With me on the call is one of the other editors of the journal, Melanie S. Tanilian, who is an associate professor in the history department at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor, and director of the program for international and comparative studies. Her monograph, The Charity of War, Famine, Humanitarian Aid, and World War I in the Middle East, tells how the Ottoman home front grappled with total war and how it sought to mitigate starvation and sickness through relief activities. She's currently working on a new book, Scandals and Salvation, German Humanitarianism in the Eastern Mediterranean, 1896 to 1933. It uncovers how a small group of German Protestant humanitarians navigated moral controversy, religious conviction, and geopolitical marginality in the Eastern Mediterranean in those years. Running the call and the tech is the journal's administrative assistant, Tizia von Bibra, based in London. She's a graduate of the LSE and Columbia University Masters in International History. So I will ask the first question to get us going, and it's about the title of your article, this enigmatic and beautiful title, Keith, The Pomegranate and the Orange, a comparative framework for genocide in the Middle East. The Ottoman Armenian Medz Yeghern and the Palestinian al-Nakba. I was wondering if you could tell our listeners a bit about that and your choices.
Well, it's such a pleasure to be joining all of you today. Thank you, Dirk. Thank you, Melanie. Thank you, Tizia, for this opportunity to talk about this work. And I really value this opportunity to sort of add value to our articles, sort of acknowledging that we live in a world where people don't always read them entirely, but also would like to listen to the discussion as well. So thank you for asking about the pomegranate and the orange. It was one of my, the pomegranate signifies the Armenian experience in the Middle East. The pomegranate, the nur in Armenian is one of the most ancient symbols on Armenian manuscripts, on Armenian carved stones, predating even the Christian era. It's become part and parcel of pop art in Armenia, and the red nature of it signifies loss and grief. And there's some great films. One of the great Armenian films, The Color of Pomegranates, by the Soviet Armenian filmmaker Parajanov. It's an Armenian symbol, a symbol of loss and grief and homeland. And the orange, and this is a very specific orange, this is the shamuti, which is what the British will call the Jaffa orange. And it's the native sweet orange to Palestine. It's something that Arabs in general associate with Palestine and with Jaffa, and you can only get it in Lebanon, where I was living until the war started, and in Palestine, and it has this wonderful sort of tangy sweetness and a big seed in it, and it's got the ugliest rind you've ever seen on an orange. You could never market it in the U.S. And the shamuti became, especially because of the writing of the great Palestinian short story writer and political activist Ghassan Kanafani, a symbol of loss of homeland, but also the failures of the first generation of Palestinians in 1948 to effectively fight to preserve the homeland. And what's interesting is it became a site of resistance as well, as the Israeli state sought to integrate the Palestinian Jaffa orange into its export market. And Palestinian activists even engaged in poisoning some of the oranges to prevent their export, and to reclaim it as a symbol of Palestinian identity. So I see these two symbols as the first in a series of ways that Palestinians and Armenians who live in the same part of the Eastern Mediterranean, who have all sorts of overlapping elements of their history, that these two symbols of shared suffering, of shared resistance, of grief and grieving in the face of genocide and mass atrocity really sort of worked for me to share this idea. And then I also in the title, I do use the word genocide in it, but I also use the two words that Palestinians and Armenians use to describe the atrocities that they faced. Medz Yeghern is one of the words, one of the phrases that's used to describe the genocide of the Ottoman Armenians, which we can either we can engage in a discussion and probably should about when it began and when it ended, but I focus primarily on the era 1915 to 1922, and al-Nakba, which means catastrophe, and Medz Yeghern means great catastrophe as well. Al-Nakba, which means catastrophe, which was the term used to describe the 1948 genocide against the Palestinians at the formation of the State of Israel, is I think the word to use that is most parallel to Medz Yeghern.
That's interesting and compelling. I mean, obviously, the orange symbol has been intrinsic to the Levant and Palestinian identity, and I think Mark Levine's first book had Jaffa and
He
Orange in
published.
the title, right?
That's
Yeah, and
right.
he's also one of the editors of the journal. But one of the referees of your article was wondering why don't you use a watermelon, if you recall.
Watermelon's a more modern social media like
Yeah.
me, right? And um, it didn't really. Watermelon is a good symbol. It's got the colors of the Palestinian flag, so it's more
Mm.
something that is emblematic of the more contemporary era when um, uh, the Israeli state bans the display of the Palestinian flag. No, but I'm much more. I mean, in my own work, I'm much more interested in driving this history back to not just our present moment, but understanding how the present genocide of the Palestinians in Gaza is something that has its origins 3 generations ago now.
Mm.
And it's part of this long unfolding process. Genocide is process, not genocide is event. And the orange really, it spoke to me in terms of that. Watermelon's
Yeah.
great. A watermelon is really about the now. And the orange is about this long history of Palestinian displacement.
Yeah. Well, but the next article will be from the orange to the watermelon. Now,
Perhaps.
Hopefully.
a different kind of history. Melanie, you hand over to you?
Yeah, I guess I'll get to the comparison. So you write in your piece, and this maybe gets a little bit to the content for those of our listeners who have not read the article, but you write about the intertwined and intimate nature of these two communities' histories of displacement, resistance, and suffering. So you set your piece up with this sort of kind of history where Palestinians and Armenians find themselves intertwined and intimately related. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about this shared history.
Sure. I think I was trying to think how to introduce this, and I was thinking about my own experience with the Armenian communities of the Middle East, of Palestinians, and I reflect back. When did I first start thinking about this? I first began to think about this in 1986. In conversation with my friend Sarah Lee Whitson, who for many years was the director of the Middle East section of Human Rights Watch. And Sarah Lee is a Jerusalemite Armenian. And we were junior year abroad students together at the American University in Cairo. And it was talking with her that I first began to see the parallels between, she would unfold, how that her interest in activism on behalf of Palestinians was also because of her Armenian origin, and how Armenian suffering and Palestinian suffering had become intertwined, in part because when Armenians were forcibly displaced during the genocide of 1915, many of the survivors arrived in Palestine, where humanitarian aid organizations had set up refugee camps, orphanages to care for the Armenians. There also is the Armenian Quarter in Jerusalem, which has been a center for Armenian religion, culture, and education for centuries. And so her juxtaposition in the 1980s of the Palestinian experience and the Armenian experience had really shaped my vision for this in the intervening many years, more years than I would like to count. And then when Dirk asked me to think about this, I revisited that idea. But that the other conceptual framework is that these are Middle Eastern peoples. Palestinians and Armenians are Middle Eastern peoples. They were subjects of the Ottoman Empire and then briefly citizens of the Ottoman Empire, and that the processes that unfolded around them and to them, and the languages of resistance and the available tools that they had were very similar, in part because they were part and parcel of Ottoman society. So that's some of the origin point. But also the other origin point is more recent Armenian activism on behalf of Palestinians. And I talk about that at the beginning of the article. I was deeply moved, for example, by the writing of Elise Semerjian, who also appeared in this journal earlier on, and I reference her book extensively and that article as well, who was really on the forefront of trying to persuade both the general sort of Ottoman and Armenian studies community in particular that this was a similar cause. And then also this incredible artistic exposition by Feruns Hagopian, where she took and juxtaposed photographs from 1915 of Armenians being deported with what was happening to Palestinians also happening to Armenians in Karabakh, and then what happened to to Palestinians in Gaza. And it's that sort of the similarity of those images of families being forced to march along desert roads with just their belongings on their back into an uncertain future, really, spoke to me as well. And so that was one of the other origin points, and I discussed that in the beginning of the article about how Elise in particular begins to think about this idea of the intuitive understanding of genocide that survivors and descendants of survivors have. They know it when they see it, and when they saw what was happening to the Palestinians in Gaza, they knew that resonated with them because it felt so familiar, felt like what had happened to their ancestors as well.
So if we take these shared histories and also the sort of shared presence, and then go into or move towards the catastrophe, the Medz Yeghern, and also the Nakba, and you talk about the shared logic of elimination, a shared architecture of permanency, and a shared language of dispossession to really get to these shared experiences of these two catastrophes, these two moments of mass violence.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder if you can take our listeners through these 3 points of departure.
So the first is this sort of the ideological component, where I begin to think about how beginning really after the Young Turk Revolution in 1908, that the Ottoman state begins to construct, using, to borrow a term from Dirk, this sort of collective, permanent security vocabulary, right, begins to construct the Armenians as an existential threat to the Ottoman state, right? That they said that the Armenians are like a cancer in Ottoman society, that they are a danger. They're a danger. And this is then seen eventually in legislation that's passed by the wartime legislation passed by the Ottoman Empire that provides an opportunity to regional governors and military commanders the ability to deport Armenians just because they think that they might pose some kind of threat. At the same time, there within this sort of logic that's being articulated, there is a departure of an Ottoman from the Ottoman past that saw Armenians as being members of, even though on a secondary or tertiary level, members of the Ottoman community, as being outside of that community, being pushed beyond its boundaries in favor of a preferred ethnic group. And what we know very clearly, this work that's been done by our colleagues on the Ottoman Empire, Taner Akjam and so on, just documents this extremely well, which is that as Armenians are forced to leave their homeland, they're immediately replaced by refugees, Muslim refugees and settlers from the Balkans and from an expanding Russia. So I thought, well, is there a parallel to this sort of language of threat and the creation of a preferred ethnicity in the case of the Palestinians? And yes, I mean, if we look at early Zionist thought, the mere existence of the Palestinians in the land of Palestine constituted the threat to the Zionist project. But then also we see this same exact sort of parallel use of the notion of the Jew, the European Jew in particular, as the preferred ethnicity to replace the Palestinian. And so these what I'm able to begin to show, and I really, this is a challenge that I really want to pose to people who know their Zionist scholarship better than I do, which is that I argue that early Zionist thinkers were really aware of what the Ottoman state was doing to the Armenians, and that they saw in that a kind of available set of laws and ideas that they could then translate into their setting. And this is made even more, I mean, this is something that often gets sort of lost in the history of early Zionism, is that David Ben-Gurion and others were Ottoman citizens who had gone to school at the law school in Istanbul, and only late in World War I abandoned the Ottoman cause, in part because they were expelled to Egypt, and the early Yishuv was also facing attacks and vilification by the Ottoman state. So I was really curious. That's the first element, is sort of, the creation of the Palestinian, the almost identical creation of the Palestinian and the Armenian as a threat to the integrity of the preferred or imagined nation that was being created by revolutionary elites, and then this sort of creation of a kind of, this land should have a certain kind of ethnicity, a preferred ethnicity in those lands. The second is this idea of the permanence of absence, right? And the permanence of absence is an idea that I derive in part also from the study of genocide of the indigenous, right? This sort of larger study of the genocide of the indigenous. And I make an argument in the article that while that's really useful, I think generally that in terms of talking about the Palestinians, we don't always need to go to that area of genocide scholarship. And I offer the Armenian case as an opportunity to not necessarily refer to indigenous genocide. But nonetheless, for in both cases of the Ottomans and the early Zionists, it was the threat posed by the Armenians and the Palestinians was much less of a strategic military threat. In fact, it was never really that much of a threat. It was their presence that was threatening, because if they remained where they were, it would have been impossible to create the state that they wanted. And so the permanence of absence is related to this ideology of the preferred ethnicity, in that as Palestinians, as Armenians are moved, either their homes and their villages are destroyed so that they cannot re-inhabit them. Their land is destroyed so it cannot be restored to use for farming, or, as I mentioned earlier, settlers are immediately brought in both cases. And this is this critical work that's shown both by the new Israeli historians, but other people like Rashi Khalidi, about how systematic either both the herbicide in 1948 was, the destruction of hundreds and hundreds of Palestinian villages, and then the immediate resettlement in some villages of European settlers. The same in Anatolia, as Raymond Kevorkian, the great Franco-Armenian historian of the genocide, has documented thousands of Armenian villages that were destroyed, and particularly in the province of Van, the settlements and tiny villages and cities that were obliterated. And in fact, you can see these places when you go traveling in Eastern Anatolia. You just wander through the countryside and you find a village that the local Kurds will often say, "Oh yeah, that's where the Armenians live," and it's gone, right? So that's the next part. And then what's the final part again? Remind me. It's the
Shared language of
shared
dispossession.
language of dispossession. So the shared language of dispossession has three core elements. It's herbicide, memoricide, and toponymicide. And again, the herbicide is this destruction of the built environment of these communities, but not just so that people can't move in, but that their physical presence on the land is erased. And so this also includes the destruction of churches, of mosques, of other institutional forms that marked the presence. Uh, and I reference in the book the work of Nadia Abdul Haj and Helnar Watenpaugh on sort of the discussion of the erasures at Ani, the great Armenian city in Eastern Anatolia, and then the formation of an Israeli national archaeology, which sort of digs through any layers of Arab, Muslim, Mamluk era archaeology to try to get to something in the Bronze Age. Then there's memoricide. Memoricide is a very similar thing, but in here it's sort of the destruction of forms of cultural heritage, books in particular, books and libraries. There's an incredibly important parallel in terms of libraries and forms of cultural property, and this is where we have another important legal parallel between the Palestinians and the Armenians, which is the absentee property laws that were articulated both in the Ottoman Empire and by the Zionists. And so in both cases, um, the 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 populations that's faced forced deportation and genocide are seen as absent, and in their absence and inability to return, not because they don't want to, but because they're prevented from returning, the state then becomes the owner of their property in their absence. And that state was hostile to their presence in the first place. And so this is what has happened, for example, to the great libraries of Palestine, to an enormous amount of church property in Anatolia. It's that same kind of use of law to facilitate the erasure of cultural heritage. And then finally, this erasure process takes place through parallel processes of what's called toponymicide, which is the transformation of place names from their Arab or Palestinian origin or Armenian or Kurdish origin in Anatolia to something that's like purely Turkish or purely Hebrew. In the case of Israel, using the Bible as a kind of gazetteer, and in the case of Anatolia, making Turkish-sounding names and words. I talked briefly about the renaming of the great church in Lake Van, Akdamar, as Agdamar or Agdamar in Turkish, which sort of sounds like the original Armenian, but actually is a nonsense word in Turkish. But you could see really Turkish. The one that I've always thought was really touching was the Palestinian village of Lubya, which is the name for the black-eyed pea, which is like a great food, and it speaks of home and sort of community. renaming it La Vie, which just means lion, and is sort of a triumphalist name. So though that's how these are these parallels. And I think one thing I want to emphasize is that in the article, I point out that these are not just sort of abstract comparisons, that that coursing through all of these kinds of structures and ideologies are really are elements that um, derive from Ottoman state and society, and then also from sort of the way that evolved during the interwar mandate period as well. And that's where I really want to sort of try to push our field, which is to think about genocide within regional terms, and to begin to disconnect it from the kind of use, for example, of the Holocaust as exemplar, and really locate it within this regional context and this shared Ottoman past. And one can imagine we could do this in other parts of the world as well.
There's a fourth shared experience
Mhm.
that you point out towards the end of your article that builds on this idea of erasure, and that is the common denial that both of these communities face in the side of catastrophe. You talk
That's
more
right.
about that.
So, so as all of you know, I've been teaching comparative genocide for 25 years now. Um, and the one thing that I always tell my students is that every genocide is denied. Like, all genocide is denied. It's one of the few elements of genocide that's truly shared by all experiences of genocide. And the that those of us who really entered the field of Armenian genocide studies 2 decades ago, we faced uh, really structural denial fostered by the state of Turkey itself. A very, very powerful state had undertaken and obligated itself to the global denial of genocide, using all the power that a modern nation state has to do it, from sponsoring academic chairs at American universities, creating grant programs where they could pick winners and losers in the field itself, to sort of aggressive lobbying of American institutions to prevent them from recognizing genocide. President Biden is the first United States president to recognize the genocide of the Armenians. And as far as I can tell, the current occupant of the White House is turning that recognition back. So the denial, of course, we're going to find denial in the case of the Palestinians, and indeed, I think we've all experienced that in our own lives, in the last couple of years, where colleagues and universities, institutions in our own state have said, no, you can't use the word genocide to describe what's happening to the Palestinians. It doesn't meet the threshold of intent and so on. And so those parallel processes of denial are present. But what makes the Armenian and the Palestinian case so important, so parallel, is the fact that very powerful states are engaged in that denial, right? That Israel and its ally, the United States, is at the forefront of the denial of and the dehumanization of Palestinians. And at least historically, it was the United States and Turkey that were in cahoots around the denial of the Armenian genocide.
Um, I wanted to talk to you a little bit because we've talked in the past quite a lot about this idea of an ethics of comparison. And what is unique about the comparison between the Armenian case and the Palestinian case? Where does it get us? And what do you understand to be an ethics of comparison?
So the ethic of an ethic of comparison, uh, I should give proper credit to Michael Rothberg,
Mm-hmm.
who began to think about this. Um, is I think for Michael, it was more, how would you situate the Holocaust against what's happening in Israel, Palestine? But for me, it became more, how do you how do you hold people accountable to an ethic of comparison where they don't give a pass to certain groups or peoples who are committing genocide because of any because of a history of genocide that had faced their own community, right? So, in other words, I see this more of a burden on communities that have faced genocide to be willing to be at the forefront, sort of lean into uh, calling out and charging genocide, right? And so, for example, you see this in the states that brought the case against Israel at the International Court of Justice. It was brought by South Africa and Ireland, right? Who could see a parallel in what was facing the Palestinians to their own historical experience. And then the ethic of comparison motivated them to act. So I see the ethic of comparison as, if you see genocide, you have to call it out, especially if it's something that seems to resemble what has happened to your community in the past. And the ethic of comparison means that you cannot hide behind genocide a past of genocide to stay absent from that accusation. So it's really a call in particular to descendants of the Holocaust or the genocide of the Jews of Europe to be willing to see genocide being committed by the state of Israel against Palestinians as an ethical burden as descendants of genocide. I also think that I think the study of genocide is improved in a broad-based comparative framework, because if it lends itself, because it sort of has this quasi-legal underpinning, it sort of lends itself to forms of comparison. But it's also, this is something that I think I've learned over the last quarter century teaching genocide, which is that if you just want to compare all genocides, say, to the Holocaust, it doesn't push the scholarship forward very well. And so in my own work, I've been very interested in, for example, I have a previous paper where I look at forms of child transfer and education at American Indian boarding schools and at a series of orphanages that were created by the Ottoman state to change Armenians into Turks, and of course change indigenous Native American young people into appropriate American subjects. So I think that tends to be, I think this is one of the frontiers of the field itself that actually gets us around a lot of the problems with centering the Holocaust. And this is, I think in my teaching in particular, I really, I bring together sort of discussions of bureaucracy, for example, in the destruction of the Kurds by Iraq, and the use of media in Rwanda. I mean, these are interesting things to compare and contrast. So that's the ethic of comparison, and I think it's something that, if this field really is to take, if it's going to continue, and I think it's really a robust and valuable field, it's embracing this notion of that ethic, which is important to us and something that we should try to do.
Is one thing. Another is method, which in the end is required as well. And what I found compelling about your framing, and you use the word frame as the key word for your approach rather than method, is that you, as you mentioned a few minutes ago, steer away from the Holocaust archetype, which is a move which is embedded in our field, or has been embedded in our field for such a long time. And I criticize in my own book on the history of the genocide concept in the field of genocide studies. I mean, what you're making a plea for here is that we need to think of genocidal conjunctions in regional terms because of regional dynamics. In this case, the Ottoman and post-Ottoman societies having a particular unique or distinctive dynamic, which will be different from East Central Europe, although there'll be contact, obviously, but also different from settler colonial contexts like Australia and North America, which I've studied. and different from the Holocaust, although they all obviously have something in common. Otherwise, you couldn't use a generic term like genocide. In any event, the point is not to always keep looking for something that looks like the Holocaust, or that looks like the SS, or that looks like Gestapo, or what have you. I mean, that's been so common. Earlier in settler colonial genocide studies in Australia, although people didn't use the term at the time, in, say, the 70s and 80s, especially in the 70s, there was a lot of new research on frontier violence. And, and historians would say, that these particular police detachments which went after Indigenous Australians or Native Australians, they were, they were resembled Einsatzgruppen, it's that kind of slippage, or that it was like a gulag, and it's completely unnecessary. And what's refreshing is you seem to be saying that we need to look at the Ottoman and post-Ottoman dynamics as their own thing, and you have these sort of three elements, and we don't need to keep referring or have recourse to the Holocaust. Could you just quickly reiterate that for our listeners? Because I think this will really set free this field from what was a foundational mistake. Because otherwise, the field, I think, doesn't have much of a future, because these debates within the field, academic debates, also have a real world correlate. And the real world correlate is explicable, rather visible in the debate about whether genocide is going on in Gaza. And the people who are saying it's not going on are saying, we were fighting terrorism, and yes, Gaza has been laid waste, but so was Dresden. And when you're fighting fascists, and they're hiding among civilians, this is the inevitable result of urban warfare, especially if conducted by aeroplanes, by bombing from above. And the civilian casualties are regrettable. They were never intended. Ergo, it's not genocide. I mean, that's basically the argument. It's a war, not a genocide. And, quite a few Holocaust historians have been digging their heels in using that argument. And the arguments are not just in the academic journals, but also in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the blogs, and so forth. So, were you to intervene also publicly as well as in an academic journal, what would you say to listeners?
Well, wow, it's a big question, and we've been trying to answer it now for a couple of years. So, the first thing I would say is that in the study of genocide, the Holocaust must always be an example, not the exemplar. That's a fact, right? But that's lost on in a public setting. That's lost on most people, because the only genocide they seem to know about is the Holocaust, right? And they might have some inkling of the Armenian Genocide because they took like 15 minutes of it in high school in California, right? So we can't start from that position, right? We have to start from a different position entirely, which is to say, look, what's happening in Palestine has its origins in 1948. This is core to my argument, right? Which is that we cannot disconnect what's happening in Gaza today from what happened in Palestine in 1948. So we start the conversation more around this post-Ottoman Mandate era history. And it was a history in which Zionist leaders who've been exposed to the violence and atrocities of the Armenian Genocide, the exchange of populations, right, before the Holocaust, began to elaborate a framework that would permit them to remove the Palestinians, right? And depending on where you were in sort of Zionist ideology, right, that removal could be exchange of populations, largely peaceful, but terrible, to extermination, right? Jabotinsky to Ben Gurion, right? And I think that if we as scholars, I mean, maybe we got ourselves into I agree entirely with South Africa's case, but we may have written ourselves into a trap when we were saying, oh, we have to use the word genocide, because we wanted to use the word genocide because it was so horrible. We too didn't have the vocabulary, the quick shorthand vocabulary, to explain to people why this is so awful, what's happening, why it's such a grotesque moral failure. And so, so that's what I'm asking us to think about, which is that let's think about a longer term effort situated in the beginning in the World War I era, right? Which I think for the Armenians, in fact, can extend back to the 1880s and 1890s, of the transformation of this region from a multicultural, multilinguistic empire into a collection of nation states. And as that process takes place, just like it did, I think this is where you can make some valuable parallels with Eastern Europe during the similar period, right? That this leads to this violent sorting of peoples. And so what I think is important about what I've done here is I've said to those who, and there's a Palestinian scholars who do this too, but mostly Israeli scholars who want to sort of exempt themselves from being part of the history of the Middle East to making it more like a European history, right? To say, oh, no, what was happening, what the Zionists did was part and parcel of what was happening in Iraq, what was happening in Turkey, right? What was happening also in the Caucasus, that it was part and parcel of the same kind of exterminationist, ultranationalist logic. And that the dynamic, of course, changes for the Palestinians and the Israelis in the aftermath of the creation of the State of Israel and its integration into kind of an American security sphere. And that changes it. And you can make a really good case around that. So that, we start off, if this were if we were at this sailing race, we would be 20 minutes behind if we just start off by trying to say, oh, we'll define this around our version, our sort of scholarly understanding of what genocide is, right? And instead, if we say, look, what's happening to the Palestinians now has its origins in the creation of the State of Israel itself. And that's what's important too about what Fatima Mugego-Czech talks about in her book, right? Which is that she was really original in thinking, let's situate what happened to the Armenians in a longer history of Anatolia and understand the kind of violence becoming a habit of state and how you can draw parallels between what happened to the Armenians and then later to the Alevis and the Kurds in the generations since, which unfold almost identically and almost the same words and the same sort of forms of memoricide and toponymicide, right? So she had the insight to see how this unfolded. And I think we have to do the same sort of operation in the Eastern Mediterranean as well. I mean, for example, I see incredible parallels between Ba'ath's policies towards Iraqi Kurds and recent Israeli actions. Right. So that's we can't. Sometimes you just know there's kinds of battles you can't win because the popular notion is so strong. But this is where we are, right? And I think that the use of the term genocide is appropriate in this setting, but we should be willing to use other tools and other histories to get to the same endpoint.
Tizia, do you want to ask a wrap-up question, which will give Keith an opportunity to range even further and wider?
Yes, thank you, Keith. Well, we asked all of our authors in these interviews to give us 2 book recommendations of works that have either influenced your thinking as a scholar or just works that you think should be more widely read. So what are your 2 lists?
So I actually have one that's right here. It's lots of notes in it. I don't know if other authors have recommended this as well, but I think this is it's a well-written book. It's very accessible, Justice for Some, and it's the use of it explains how the Israeli state has used law and what she calls lawfare and continually shifting interpretations of law to dispossess and murder Palestinians. And it also is a kind of her version of the history of the Palestinian movement, especially of the abandonment of resistance in the 1990s in favor of the Oslo Accords. It's just a very trenchant critique of that. So I encourage people to take a look at this book. I'll tell you how, though, it's been very influential in something that I'm working on right now. So before Dirk asked me to write this article, I was trying to finish another article where I think I try to approach the Genocide Convention as a colonialist and racist document. And what I'm trying to do is understand she helped me understand how law, which is supposed to be objective and neutral, actually can foster colonialism and racism, right? And it was very helpful, as is Dirk's work on the origin of the Genocide Convention as well. And I was juxtaposing it with communities who have made the charge of genocide, but have had that charge of genocide roundly dismissed: African Americans and indigenous North Americans. And so this again will probably be my final broad comparative work on genocide before I turn back to my history of the Syrian civil war. And the other book is Elise Semerjian's book Remnants, which is a I don't. This is not enough to call this, but it's a feminist history of the Armenian Genocide, right? And Elise and I cover some of the same ground in terms of the treatment of women and children, but she just takes it in these amazing directions, talking about the use of tattooing on skin and necropolitics and how the genocide took place on Armenian women's bodies, and how survival also and resistance is located there as well. And I think it's really, it's won the Lemkin Award. It's a truly innovative work. And so both of these works, I think, could actually be read together, which would and we did so in a seminar here at Davis as well. But yeah, so I also just want to mention a brief plug for another project I'm working on right now, which I hope to again sort of expand the available vocabulary of genocide studies, which is that about a decade ago, I edited the memoir of Karnik Panyan, who was a Armenian child survivor of genocide, who during the genocide was taken from a concentration camp near Hama and interned in a Ottoman state orphanage near Beirut on Tura, where he was subjected to Turkification, often extraordinary violence at the hands of the people who were supposed to take care of him. And it was something very similar, of course, to what I draw similarities with what happened to indigenous children in the United States. And so I'm working with a young Armenian artist named Tigran Arakelian, with the support of Stanford University Press, to turn it into a graphic novel, which we're hoping will be useful in high school settings, but also for young adults. It's just a way to reach a different audience. In fact, that's why I was not in Beirut when the bombs started falling, but in Yerevan in order to work with him on doing this project. So we're hoping that this will be out in the fall of next year, and it's been a really fun process, but also a lot harder than you think to produce a graphic novel, especially with artists. Artists are almost as tough to work with as academics. But it's been a really wonderful opportunity to explore the material and visual culture of Armenians during an era of genocide. And I just also want to thank the journal for this opportunity to bring thoughts together that have been coursing through my mind since I was 19 years old, in seeing the parallel experiences, and also, unfortunately, seeing in the parallels the future, which is that we know what happened to the Armenians, right? The Armenians are no longer a presence in their homeland. Genocide works, right? There's small residual communities of Armenians in Istanbul and Musada, but they're really not. They live in a subordinate and actually terrified existence, really not being permitted to be part of modern Turkish society, right? And Armenians are now in diaspora, separated from their homeland, or they live in this small rump state of Armenia itself, which is perpetually under threat. That's what happens, right? And so when we think about, so for the last very long time, I've perceived in the history of Palestinians that same pathway, leading ultimately to the complete erasure from their homeland and being sent into diaspora. And so I think that one of the things that we're supposed to do as scholars of genocide is say this is what could happen, right? And unfortunately, this is probably what will happen.
Well, on that bracing and somber note, we bring this discussion to an end. Keith, thank you so much for taking time to talk with us and project your brilliant and important ideas to our listeners. Thank you, Melanie, for joining us from al-Nakba, and Tizia, as usual, for running the show in front of the scenes and behind the scenes. This will go on our YouTube channel pretty soon, and then we'll promote it on all our social media channels and hopefully bring more readers to your incredible article, Keith. Thank you so much.
Thank you.